We're going to end the 19th century by looking at the wider range of visual culture beyond fine art. We've already explored the changes and issues that photography introduced. That's one example of visual culture. Now let's turn to design and advertising and some competing movements that overlapped realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism, and challenge them in some ways. We'll start with the arts and crafts movement. Modern artists wrangled over different subjects, styles, and techniques, but they assumed that painting and sculpture would continue to be necessary and viable products in a modern world, and that meant that their status, and to some extent their employment, was secured. Artists benefited from the growing public perception of fine art as a unique and special category of cultural production, different from anything else people made. What about other valuable things? Costly things like jewelry and furniture, textiles and silver. What about the people who made them? They weren't fine artists. How were they affected by new technologies and new aesthetics in a modern world? In the 19th century, those kinds of things were categorized as the decorative arts, and the people who made them were called craftsmen or designers. Decorative arts could be handmade, like the elegant fish knife on the screen. They could be one-of-a-kind objects. They could be custom designed and commissioned jewelry and intended for a particular person, like the diamond and sapphire brooch that was Prince Albert's wedding gift to Queen Victoria. However, industrialization meant that some things once made by hand could be made by machine faster and cheaper. Regardless of cost, beauty, or technique, everyone understood that the decorative arts had a utilitarian purpose as well. Jewelry was for adornment, china and silver graced dinner tables, people sat on chairs and walked over the most valuable rugs. That perception of utilitarianism, of an object being used, washed, dusted, scratched, broken, maybe even stored away or replaced, is what separated the decorative arts from the fine arts, regardless of how costly the material or time-consuming their construction. Now we use the word design to designate objects that are not fine art, and to describe the style and aesthetics of anything from a piece of silver to an iPhone, from a handbag to a teapot. The demand for well-designed objects and the status that we assign particular brands or names translates into economic terms as well. People pay a premium for manufactured objects if they carry a desirable design name. And ironically, today many people are more familiar with famous contemporary designers than with their counterparts in fine art. That's certainly the case with Michael Graves. Most people don't know he's an architect, but he is very well known for his teapots. In the late 1870s, that was not the case. A British textile designer, William Morris, was a vocal critic about the consequences of the Industrial Revolution on the decorative arts and craft in general. Morris wanted to see designers and craftsmen enjoy the same status as fine artists, and he was worried about the quality and design of machine products and how they would affect standards of taste and aesthetics, as well as future employment. His concerns resulted in what we call the arts and crafts movement. You may be surprised that it was the British who championed this cause, because we have really focused on France. However, England had industrialized before the French, and since the 18th century, businessmen there had been actively involved in identifying and training people in design for textiles, wall coverings, china painting, and furniture. There were government-sponsored design schools and considerable discussion about design reform, in particular the relationship of decoration to design, as well as interest in designing and manufacturing goods that were less ornamental. Germs had just been discovered, and some designers argued that heavily ornamented objects collected dust and germs, and that made for an unhealthy environment. Most agreed, however, that good designs could and would be factory-made. This was critical, since England had huge investments in manufacturing and wanted to continue expanding. Morris disagreed. He was concerned about aesthetics and quality in design and the place of craft in a modern, capitalized, and technologically driven culture where more and more objects that used to be made by hand were now being made by machines. In this, he was influenced by John Ruskin, the most prolific art and architecture scholar in 19th century England. Ruskin wrote on everything from art to botany. He thought that the Gothic style was the epitome of artistic fulfillment because it was based on nature and individually executed. By the 1870s, he was deeply mired in issues of political economy, the dignity of labor, and the value of nature as inspiration. That political, economic, and cultural context is critical to understanding the issues of the arts and crafts movement. Morris and his advocates argued that the Industrial Revolution had isolated people from their own inherent creativity, which was best demonstrated in the handmade object. Mass-produced goods were cheap, but they believed that they erred on the side of over-ornamentation and unnecessary decoration. They didn't focus on good design and high-quality materials. Factory piecemeal work was described as soulless and degrading, compared to the honest and authentic labor of the individual craftsman who took pride in his work. Morris was convinced that the quality of life would be improved if all people, not just the wealthy, could use beautiful and well-made everyday objects, and he did not see industry providing them. Aesthetically, Morris was closely aligned with British Pre-Raphaelite artists who rejected the decadence and frivolous painting of the Royal Academy and embraced Quattrocento Italian styles. He shared their preference for those styles and for the Gothic, for moralizing subjects and delicate, intricate detail that recalled nature in the predominance of floral and vegetal motifs. He was especially renowned for his wallpaper and textile designs. They were heavily patterned and beautifully colored with intricate patterns that he based on Gothic influences and nature. They became very popular. His interior design firm targeted domestic homes and churches with the goal of designing and providing everything, from wall coverings to stained glass to furniture, upholstery, drapery, and rugs. Run collaboratively, Morris and his colleagues provided the original designs, which were then made by skilled craftsmen. Obviously, this kind of custom-designed and made approach to interior furnishing was not cheap, and even his wallpaper remained far too expensive for most people. The cray pattern on the screen was printed on cotton. Now, cotton was cheap, but this was the most labor-intensive pattern Morris ever created. It required 34 blocks to print the design, which meant it was the most expensive design his firm ever sold, and still, it was the most popular among his wealthy clients. Morris was also interested in typography, and in 1890 he established the Kelmscott Press and designed a new typeface called Golden Type, based on the 15th century style of Nicholas Jensen. Kelmscott Press produced high-quality and very expensive historical and contemporary texts using this new typeface on costly paper, including John Ruskin's The Nature of Gothic. However, beautiful as these texts were, they were labor-intensive to make and costly to buy. Their clientele was select and limited. They were not an effective challenge to mass-produce books and journals, and Golden Type did not transfer easily into advertising needs. The arts and crafts movement was one of several reform movements that developed in the late 19th century, including vegetarianism and folk song revival. Somewhat nostalgically, supporters of those movements focused on romantic notions about nature and folk culture as more authentic, in contrast with what they saw as the artificiality of modern life. The aesthetics movement was another example. Advocates of that ranged from the designer Edward Godwin to the American artist James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Godwin hated what he called fluff and dust, and wanted people to adopt furniture with a minimum of decoration, which was easy to clean and very modern. He described his sideboard as a grouping of solids and voids. Its lines were sleek and geometric with no extraneous decoration. From ideas like these, modern designers and architects would move to the tenet of form following function. Whistler spent most of his professional life as a painter and was interested in formal issues and abstraction rather than narrative. In 1876, he was involved in designing the dining room for the Liverpool shipbuilder, Frederick Leyland. Whistler was really only asked to consult on paint colors, but he was a bit of an overachiever in this. Within 2 years, he had completely transformed the room, rejecting the fussy Victorian styles for the simplified lines of Japanese design. Installed now in the freer gallery of the Smithsonian, it has long been referred to as the Peacock Room, so named for the fighting peacock painting on the wall that the artist made and intended to be a reference to the contentious relationship he had with his patron. There was no singular style to arts and crafts. It was a position about the value of making and the individuality of the designer or the craftsman in an increasingly mechanized world. It had very strong roots in social issues, concern over the alienation of the modern citizen, the lack of a relationship between the maker of the goods and the consumer of the goods. Karl Marx was criticizing industrialization for some of the very same reasons. In fact, William Morris went on to become a socialist. In identifying the ongoing problems of rapid industrialization and mass consumption, and trying to reconcile that with the realities of modern society and its impulses towards innovation and progress, their 19th century concerns sound very much like ours today. Throughout the 19th century, custom-made objects of all kinds, from jewelry to clothing and furniture, always remained an option, but only for the very wealthy. It was a utopian dream to imagine that craftsmen could successfully challenge the assembly line, and impossible to put the industrial genie back in the bottle. English textile artisans who identified with the Luddite movement earlier in the century had tried and failed. On the other hand, the arts and crafts movement did ignite a new interest in the decorative arts, and, more importantly, offered a springboard for Art Nouveau, which would redirect energy to aesthetics and champion the unity of all art and design. That's going to be the focus of the last lecture for this class, and what a great way to finish, by learning about a movement that was sensual in its aesthetic, ambitious in its goal, rooted in design, and determined to unite all arts and all art makers.